There are certain neighborhoods that appear, at first glance, to be untouched by the chaos of the outside world, where the trees grow in quiet symmetry, where the houses sit at respectful distances from one another, and where the silence at night feels less like emptiness and more like a kind of unspoken agreement between those who live there. Hillcrest Road was one such place, a quiet suburban stretch on the outskirts of a growing American town, where families had lived for decades and where strangers were noticed long before they were welcomed. It was in this very neighborhood, under a sky that had just begun to surrender to the fading warmth of late summer, that something happened which would fracture that silence forever, replacing it with whispers, suspicion, and a lingering sense that something deeply unsettling had taken root beneath the surface. On the evening of August 14th, 2023, 36-year-old Daniel Mercer failed to return home. At first, there was nothing particularly alarming about his absence, at least not to anyone outside his immediate circle, because Daniel was known to be somewhat unpredictable in his routines, often working late hours as a freelance contractor and sometimes disappearing for long stretches while completing projects that required him to travel between nearby cities. However, to his wife, Emily Mercer, there was something about that particular night that felt wrong in a way she could not immediately explain, as if an invisible thread connecting her to her husband had suddenly gone slack without warning. Emily had called him 3 times that evening, each call going straight to voicemail, and though she initially dismissed it as a dead phone battery or poor reception, the unease continued to build as the hours passed, stretching into midnight and then into the early hours of the morning, until sleep became impossible and worry settled into something far heavier. By the next afternoon, when Daniel had still not returned and his phone remained unreachable, Emily reported him missing. The investigation began quietly, as these things often do, with routine questions and methodical procedures, but it did not take long for investigators to realize that something about Daniel's disappearance did not fit the pattern of an ordinary missing person case, because his car was found less than a mile from his home, parked neatly along the side of a deserted service road that cut through a patch of undeveloped land just beyond Hillcrest. There were no signs of forced entry into the vehicle, no visible struggle, and no immediate evidence that suggested foul play. Yet the circumstances themselves felt incomplete, as though a crucial piece of the story had been deliberately removed. Inside the car, investigators found Daniel's wallet, his laptop bag, and a half-empty bottle of water, all arranged in a way that suggested he had not intended to be gone for long. And yet there was no trace of him in the surrounding area. No footprints, no discarded items, and no witnesses who had seen him after he parked there. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his own life and vanished. As days turned into weeks, the search intensified, drawing in volunteers, local law enforcement, and eventually state investigators, all combing through the surrounding fields, wooded areas, and drainage systems, hoping to uncover some clue that would explain what had happened. But the silence persisted. Then, nearly 3 weeks after Daniel's disappearance, a development emerged that would shift the course of the investigation in a direction no one had anticipated. A neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Holloway, came forward with information that, at first, seemed insignificant, but upon closer examination, began to unravel a thread that would lead investigators into the heart of something far darker. Margaret reported that on the night Daniel disappeared, she had noticed a vehicle she did not recognize parked briefly outside the Mercer home, its engine idling in the darkness, before it slowly drove away without its headlights fully on, a detail that had struck her as unusual enough to remember. At the time, she had thought little of it, assuming it was simply someone who had taken a wrong turn. But when she later learned of Daniel's disappearance, the memory resurfaced with unsettling clarity. Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood, searching for any additional sightings or surveillance footage that might corroborate Margaret's account. And it was during this process that they discovered something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of Daniel Mercer's life. Daniel, it turned out, had secrets. Not the kind of secrets that immediately suggest danger, but rather the kind that accumulate quietly over time, hidden beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary existence until they form a pattern that is impossible to ignore. Financial records revealed that Daniel had been transferring small but consistent amounts of money to an account that did not belong to his wife. And further investigation showed that he had been in regular contact with someone whose identity was not immediately clear. The number was traced to a prepaid phone, one that had been activated only a few months prior and had no registered owner. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a series of messages between Daniel and this unknown contact. Messages that were at once vague and urgent, referencing meetings, deadlines, and something referred to only as the file. The tone of the messages suggested tension, even fear, as though Daniel had become entangled in something he could no longer control. Then came the break. A surveillance camera from a gas station located several miles away captured footage of Daniel's car on the night he disappeared, arriving at approximately 9:17 p.m. And though Daniel himself was not clearly visible, another figure could be seen approaching the vehicle, entering briefly and then exiting before the car drove away. The footage was grainy, the figure indistinct, but there was enough to suggest that Daniel had not been alone that night. This revelation transformed the case from a missing person investigation into something far more complex, raising questions about who this individual might be and what role they had played in Daniel's disappearance. Weeks passed as investigators worked to identify the figure, analyzing the footage frame by frame, cross-referencing it with known individuals in Daniel's life, and following leads that seemed promising but ultimately led nowhere. Until finally, one lead did. The prepaid phone number was linked through a series of indirect connections to a man named Victor Hale, a former business associate of Daniel's who had a history of financial disputes and questionable dealings. Victor was known to operate on the fringes of legality, engaging in transactions that were difficult to trace and even harder to prove. And though he had never been convicted of any major crimes, his name had surfaced in multiple investigations over the years. When questioned, Victor denied any involvement in Daniel's disappearance, claiming that he had not seen or spoken to him in months. But inconsistencies in his statements, combined with the evidence already gathered, placed him squarely under suspicion. A search warrant was executed at Victor's residence, and what investigators found there would confirm their worst fears. Among the items recovered was a hard drive containing encrypted files, financial records that appeared to involve large sums of unaccounted money, and, most significantly, a document that matched the description of the file referenced in Daniel's messages. The contents of the file revealed a complex scheme involving fraudulent contracts, shell companies, and the diversion of funds, a scheme that Daniel had likely discovered and, perhaps unwittingly, become a part of. It was now clear that Daniel Mercer had not simply vanished, but had been pulled into a web of deception that extended far beyond his own life. Under mounting pressure, Victor Hale's story began to unravel. After days of interrogation, he admitted to meeting Daniel on the night of his disappearance, claiming that they had arranged to discuss the file and resolve a dispute that had arisen between them. According to Victor, the meeting had escalated into an argument, one that became increasingly heated as Daniel threatened to expose the entire operation. Victor insisted that he had not intended to harm Daniel, but in the chaos of the confrontation, things had spiraled out of control. What followed was a confession that sent shockwaves through the community. Victor admitted to killing Daniel Mercer. He described in chilling detail how the argument had turned violent, how a moment of panic had led to an irreversible act, and how, in the aftermath, he had attempted to cover his tracks, disposing of Daniel's body in a remote area that had yet to be discovered. The search for Daniel's remains resumed with renewed urgency, guided by the information provided in Victor's confession, and after several days, they were found. The discovery brought a sense of closure, but not peace, because the story did not end there. As investigators continued to examine the evidence, they uncovered indications that Victor Hale had not acted alone, that there were others involved in the scheme, individuals whose identities remained unknown and whose roles in Daniel's death were still unclear. The case expanded, drawing in federal agencies and opening new lines of inquiry that extended far beyond Hillcrest Road. For Emily Mercer, the truth came at a devastating cost. The man she had known, the life they had built together, had been shattered by secrets she never knew existed, leaving her to grapple not only with loss, but with the realization that the person she loved had been living a life she could not fully understand. And for the residents of Hillcrest Road, the silence returned, but it was no longer the same. It was heavier now, burdened with the knowledge of what had happened, with the understanding that even in the most peaceful of places, darkness can take hold without warning, and that sometimes the most unsettling truths are the ones that remain hidden in plain sight. Because long after the headlines fade, and long after the investigation moves on, there are always questions that linger in the quiet spaces between what is known and what is never fully revealed. And on Hillcrest Road, those questions still echo.